karuṇā, compassion. Opening our last episode ended with a question. What happens to this moment when the body stops? What remains when the fabrication process ends? Before we go there, tonight, something we need first, the quality of heart that makes it possible to face what we will face. Not endurance, not courage. The Canon doesn't teach courage as a Brahmavihārā. It teaches karuṇā, compassion. Tonight, what that actually means. There are two ways to fail at compassion. The first is pity, standing at a distance, feeling the movement of someone else's suffering, then moving on. It registers. It doesn't enter. The Canon doesn't use the word pity, but the movement is there in the analysis. The quality that seems like compassion, but keeps its distance. You have probably felt it, watching the news of a distant disaster, reading about something terrible that happened to someone you don't know, a flicker of feeling, and then the next thing on the screen. The mind has not been changed by what it saw. Something registered, nothing entered. The second failure is less often discussed, and in some ways it is the more important one to understand, because it is the failure of people who genuinely try to help, getting so consumed by another's suffering that you can no longer function in its presence. The compassion that tips into helplessness, sitting at a bedside and being unable to speak, standing in the middle of grief and feeling only that you are drowning in it. The therapist who burns out after 15 years of caring. The hospice worker who develops what the literature calls compassion fatigue, though we will see by the end of this episode that this term is almost certainly wrong. The Canon has a name for this second failure, domanassa, distress. The Visuddhimagha, the 5th century commentarial text that systematized much of Theravada practice, calls it the near enemy of karuṇā. The quality that looks like compassion shares its field of vision, but has tipped over into the thing it was trying to address. Tonight, what genuine karuṇā actually is, where it sits between these two failures, and why the quality that makes it possible is one we already examined 3 episodes ago. Chapter 1, Canonical Definition and the Brahmavihārā Sequence. Let me start with the most useful sentence I know on this subject. It comes from Thanissaro Bhikkhu in his essay, Head and Heart Together, 14 words long. I want to give it to you first, and then unpack it. Thanissaro writes, compassion, karuṇā, is what Goodwill feels when it encounters suffering. It wants the suffering to stop. Hold that for a moment. Karuṇā is not a separate quality that exists on its own. It is what Goodwill, metta, the most fundamental Brahmavihārā, becomes when it meets suffering. The wish for beings to be happy, encountering the fact that they are not. The wish itself doesn't change. Its object has changed. Now the wish is, let the suffering stop. This matters because much of what we mean by compassion in ordinary English is something else. We use the word for the wave of feeling that moves through us when we see someone in pain. We use it for sympathy, for empathy, for the impulse to help. The Canon is more precise. Karuṇā is not a wave of feeling. It is a stable quality of heart that has a specific relationship to suffering. It wants the suffering to stop, and it does not collapse in the wanting. The canonical formula for karuṇā appears in many suttas. Let me give you the most explicit one. Anguttara Nikaya 10, Sutta 196, A. N. 10, 196. The Buddha describes how a disciple of the noble ones, having abandoned covetousness and ill will, pervades the first direction, the east, with an awareness imbued with compassion. Then the second direction, the third, the fourth, above, below, all around, everywhere, the whole encompassing cosmos. And the qualifiers the Buddha uses for this compassion are these 5 words: abundant, expansive, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will. The Pali is Vipulena Mahagatena Apamanena Avirena Abhyapajana 5 qualifiers. The middle one, apamana, means immeasurable, not directed at one person, one situation, one category of suffering. The quality that has been developed until it has no boundary. If you remember episode 6, the brain scan episode, this is the state Mathieu Ricard was generating when he stepped into Richard Davidson's laboratory at the University of Wisconsin. The researchers called it non-referential compassion, without a specific object, boundless. And the brain that was generating it produced the highest sustained gamma synchrony documented in the meditation literature at the time. We don't have to take the canon's word for it. The phenomenology, what the Pali calls apamana karuṇā, immeasurable compassion, is something a contemporary instrument was able to register from the outside. There is something else worth noticing about Anguttara Nikaya, 10-196, AN 10-196. Thanissaro flags it carefully in his translation. This sutta teaches that the Brahmavihārā practice can mitigate the effects of past unskillful kama. The image the Buddha gives, a mind that was once limited and undeveloped, becoming a mind that is immeasurable and well-developed. This is not just a meditation technique to produce pleasant states. This is, in the canonical framing, a practice that changes the consequences of who you have been. We are not going to develop that point tonight. It belongs to a different conversation. But notice the scale of the claim. The canon places these 4 qualities at the heart of how a life gets repaired. Now to the sequence. The 4 Brahmavihāras, the 4 sublime attitudes, always appear in the same canonical order: goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, metta, karuṇā, mudita, upekkha. You find this ordering in Majjhima Nikaya 7, MN7, in Digha Nikaya 13, DN13, in Anguttara Nikaya 10:196, AN 10:196, in Samyutta Nikaya 42:8, SN 42:8. The sequence is canonical. Why this ordering? Here I want to be careful. The interpretation I am about to give you is Thanissaro's. The sequence is the Buddha's. The reading of why the sequence runs in this direction is Thanissaro's synthesis, consonant with what the canon says, but not stated explicitly in the suttas. With that flag in place, karuṇā grows out of metta, the same quality meeting different conditions, meeting happiness in others, goodwill, meeting suffering, compassion, meeting another's joy, empathetic joy, and threading through all 3, equanimity, the quality we examined 3 episodes ago, which the canon places last in the sequence because it functions, in Thanissaro's words, as both an aid to and a check on the other 3. We will come back to that pairing, karuṇā and upekkha, in chapter 3. It turns out to be the key to everything else. But before we go any further, I want to flag something. The same integrity flag we raised for equanimity in episode 30, because what we are about to do, examine the near enemy of karuṇā, depends on a framework that needs honest attribution. There is a widely taught framework in Western Buddhism. You have almost certainly encountered it if you have read modern teachers like Sharon Salzberg or Jack Kornfield, or attended an insight meditation retreat in the last 40 years. The framework is the near enemies of the Brahmavihāras. Each sublime attitude, the teaching goes, has a quality that resembles it, that lives next to it in the territory of the heart, but that corrupts it. For metta, the near enemy is attached affection. For mudita, vicarious pleasure. For upekkha, indifference. And for karuṇā, the one we are looking at tonight, the near enemy, is grief. Most teachers don't mention where this framework comes from, so I will. It comes from the Visuddhimagha, written by the scholar monk Buddhaghosa in the 5th century of the Common Era, roughly 1,000 years after the Buddha's death. The Visuddhimagga is brilliant. It is one of the most important works in the Theravada tradition. It systematized much of what the Pali Canon had left as scattered teaching. It is also, and this matters, a commentary, not the Buddha's own teaching. The technical Pali term asana pakhatika, near enemy, does not appear in any sutta, anywhere. It appears only in commentarial literature, beginning with Buddhaghosa. This is the same disclosure I made in episode 30. The near enemy framework is valuable. It is not canonical. The canonical scaffolding is two things. First, the Brahmavihārā formula itself, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will, which describes karuṇā when it has succeeded, the qualities whose absence defines its failure. Second, a distinction the Buddha draws in Majjhima Nikāya 137, MN 137, between two kinds of distress, one that collapses, one that clarifies. We will come back to that distinction in the next chapter, because it turns out to be the key to understanding what Buddhaghosa was actually pointing at, what the near-enemy framework is genuinely targeting, and where the framework breaks down if you take it too far. For now, hold both things at once. The canon teaches developed karuṇā as immeasurable, abundant, without hostility, without ill will. The Visuddhimagha, 5 centuries later, draws a more specific line, a line about what happens when karuṇā fails. Both are useful. They are not the same kind of authority. The seed is canonical. The full diagnostic system is Buddhaghosa's. In the next chapter, we will look at Buddhaghosa's diagnosis with the precision he himself used. And we will see, when we get to Majjhima Nikāya 137, MN 137, why not all distress is the near enemy. The Buddha was more discerning than the popular teaching usually admits. Chapter 2. The Near Enemy, Domanassa. Buddhaghosa, in the Visuddhimagha, draws the line with unusual precision. Chapter 9, paragraph 94, Visum 994. I want to read it to you in his own language, in Bhikkhu Ñāṇamoli's translation, because the exactness of what Buddhaghosa is saying matters. He writes, compassion is characterized as promoting the aspect of allaying suffering. Its function resides in not bearing others' suffering. It is manifested as non-cruelty. Its proximate cause is to see helplessness in those overwhelmed by suffering. It succeeds when it makes cruelty subside, and it fails when it produces sorrow. That last phrase, it fails when it produces sorrow. I want you to hold the precision of this, not, karuṇā fails when it encounters sorrow. Anyone with a beating heart encounters sorrow. Not, karuṇā fails when it is in the presence of suffering. The proximate cause of karuṇā, the condition that gives rise to it, is, in Buddhaghosa's own analysis, seeing helplessness in those overwhelmed by suffering. So, encountering suffering is built into karuṇā's very definition. That is not the failure. The failure is producing sorrow. The mind that sits with another's suffering and becomes sorrowful, distressed, consumed, helpless, has not developed karuṇā. It has developed its near enemy. The wave has crossed the bank. The water meant to be carried has become the flood. 5 paragraphs later, in Visuddhimagha 9, paragraph 99, Visum 999, Buddhaghosa names the near enemy with 12 precise words. Compassion has grief based on the home life as its near enemy. Grief based on the home life. Both share in seeing failure, he says. Both are looking at the same thing, suffering. Both register that something has gone wrong, that life has come up short of what it could have been. The seeing is similar. The response is not One stays warm and steady and oriented toward relief. The other collapses inward and produces a new round of suffering in the practitioner. Now, the Pali word at the center of this is domanassa. Let me translate it literally for you. Do is a prefix meaning bad or unpleasant. Manas is the mind, mental activity. Domanassa, literally bad-mindedness. Thanissaro renders it simply as distress, mental pain, not physical. That would be dukkha vedana in a narrow sense. Domanassa is the mind's own pain, the suffering generated inside the mind in response to what it encounters. Here is where popular teaching usually stops. Most modern presentations of the near enemy framework say, the near enemy of compassion is grief, and you should avoid grief. Stay warm, stay steady, don't collapse. The Buddha was more discerning than this, and this is where I need to bring you back to Majjhima Nikaya 137, M.N. 137. The sutta I flagged in the last chapter. In Majjhima Nikaya 137, M.N. 137, the Salayatana Vibhanga, the analysis of the 6 sense bases, the Buddha distinguishes 2 completely different kinds of domanassa. 2 kinds of distress that look alike from the outside, that share the same Pali word, that occupy the same general place in the mind, but that are doing entirely different work. The first is gehasita domanassa. Geha means house, household, the domestic life. Gehasita, based on the household, dependent on the conditions of ordinary domestic existence. Household-based distress. This is the kind of distress that arises when the things of the world go badly, when something you wanted doesn't come, when someone you love is suffering and you cannot fix it, when the structure of pleasant life collapses and you collapse with it. The grief that is of the world. The distress that depends on the world being a particular way to be soothed. The second kind is nekkamasita domanassa. Nekkama means renunciation, the orientation toward release, the going forth from the household life. Nekkamasita, based on renunciation, renunciation-based distress. This is the distress that arises in someone who is striving for awakening, who knows liberation is possible, who has not yet attained it, and who feels, legitimately, the Buddha says, the urgency of that gap, the aspirant's distress, the not yet arrived ache of someone moving towards something real. Here is the crucial point. The Buddha does not say all distress is bad. He distinguishes them. The first kind, the household-based kind, is the kind he counsels his disciples to abandon. It collapses. It feeds the cycle. It is the distress of someone who has tied their well-being to conditions that will not hold. The second kind, the renunciation-based kind, he honors. It is the productive ache of a heart oriented toward what is true. When Buddhaghosa, 5 centuries later, names grief based on the home life as the near enemy of karuṇā, he is being precise. He is not saying all distress is the near enemy. He is targeting one specific kind, the household-based grief, the collapse into helplessness, the drowning in others' suffering that produces nothing but more suffering. The near enemy warning is not against feeling moved. It is against being swept away. If you have ever sat with someone who is dying, or stood in the middle of someone else's catastrophe, you have probably felt both kinds of distress in your own chest. The collapse, the moment when the suffering of the other becomes so present that you cannot speak, cannot move, cannot help. That is the near enemy. And the other thing, the steady ache that says this matters, this is real, I want to do what is possible here, that is something else. The canon does not warn against that. The canon depends on that. In episode 30, I told you the story Ajahn Chah used to point at the same kind of confusion on the equanimity side. The monk who let half his roof blow off in the rain because it's impermanent anyway. Ajahn Chah's response: that's not the equanimity the Buddha taught. That's the equanimity of a water buffalo. The same structure applies on the compassion side. The person who cannot be in the presence of suffering without drowning in it has not developed compassion. They have developed something that looks like it from the outside and consumes them from the inside. The near enemy is not the failure of caring. It is the failure of training. This is where I want to bring in some science, briefly, because what the contemplative tradition described from the inside, contemporary neuroscience has begun to describe from the outside, and the distinction it draws maps with surprising precision onto the distinction the canon draws. In 2014, Olga Klimecki, Mathieu Ricard, and Tanya Singer. Ricard is the same Buddhist practitioner from episode 6, the one whose brain produced gamma synchrony off the chart in Davidson's lab, published a study in social cognitive and affective neuroscience. The methodology was straightforward. 2 groups of participants. One was trained in empathy, developing the capacity to share, internally, the emotional state of someone who is suffering. The other was trained in compassion, developing warm, stable care for those who are suffering. Same target, other people in pain. Different orientations of the mind in response. The results were striking. The empathy-trained group, encountering images of human suffering, showed activation in the anterior insula and the anterior midcingulate cortex, regions of the brain associated with the experience of pain itself. Their affect went negative. They felt worse. Compassion training did the opposite. It reversed the negative effects. Activation shifted to the medial orbitofrontal cortex, the putamen, the pallidum, the ventral tegmental area, regions associated with warm, affiliative, reward-related states. Their affect went positive, in the presence of the same suffering. Klimecki and Singer drew a conclusion that has, I think, not yet fully penetrated public conversation. The popular term compassion fatigue, the phrase that gets applied to burned-out doctors, exhausted nurses, depleted social workers, is, in their reading, a misnomer. Compassion does not produce fatigue. What produces fatigue is empathic distress, the state of resonating with another's pain without the stable warmth of compassion as a buffer. The exhausted hospice worker is not failing at compassion. They are in its near enemy. They are doing the empathy work without the compassion work, and the empathy work alone is, in the long run, unbearable. I want to be careful here, because this kind of convergence between an ancient analysis and a modern study can sound bigger than it is. Singer's explicit Buddhist references are to the Tibetan tradition, transmitted to her through Ricard and the Mind and Life Institute. She is not engaging directly with the Pali Canon. The convergence I am pointing out between the Theravada karuṇā/domanassa distinction and the compassion/empathic distress distinction in her data is my own synthesis. The neuroscience and the canonical analysis are looking at the same phenomenon from different methodological vantage points. The brain scan and the contemplative phenomenology illuminate each other. Neither proves the other, but the structural insight is the same. There are 2 different orientations of mind in response to another's suffering. They have different signatures, in the brain and in lived experience. They produce different consequences. Burnout in one case, sustainable presence in the other. The canon drew this distinction in plain Pali centuries before anyone had thought to put a meditator inside a scanner. The scanner has caught up. Which brings me to the line at the center of this episode. The sentence I have been circling since the beginning. Compassion is not the feeling of being consumed by another's suffering. It is the quality of moving towards suffering without being swept away by it. That is what karuṇā is, not the wave. The stability that lets you walk into the water without becoming it. The most extreme canonical test of this stability is in Majjhima Nikāya 21 MN 21, the Kakachupama Sutta, the simile of the saw. The setting is specific. A monk named Molliya Phaguna has been spending too much time entangled with the nuns. When anyone criticizes them, he becomes angry. The Buddha summons him and admonishes him. The teaching the Buddha gives is the most demanding instruction on the maintenance of the heart anywhere in the canon. The exact phrasing, Thanissaro's translation, 14 words, is this: even if bandits were to carve you up savagely into pieces with a two-handled saw, even then, even there, the Buddha continues, he among you who let his heart get angered, even at that, would not be doing my bidding. Even then, you should train yourselves. Our minds will be unaffected. We will say no evil words. We will remain sympathetic, with a mind of goodwill, and with no inner hate. I need to flag something the popular teaching of this sutta often misses. The pervasion the Buddha describes 5 times across 5 great similes is awareness imbued with goodwill, metta, not karuṇā. The sutta is goodwill framed throughout. It is not a karuṇā-specific teaching, but the demonstration it offers is precisely the stability that makes karuṇā possible. The mind that can maintain this quality of orientation when its own body is being destroyed. That mind can be present with another's suffering without being destroyed by it. The training is not for the easy cases. The training is for the extreme. And the quality the training builds is what underwrites everything we have been talking about. It has not achieved distance. It has achieved depth. The ground is solid enough to absorb what comes. That is the bridge to the last analytical move I want to make tonight. What is it exactly that lets karuṇā stand on this ground without being swept away? What is the quality that holds the warmth in place when the warmth alone would tip over into its near enemy? The answer is one we already met 3 episodes ago. And in Chapter 3, I want to make the pairing explicit. Chapter 3, What Makes Karuṇā Possible? The answer is one we sat with 3 episodes ago. Upekkha, equanimity, the 4th of the 4 Brahmavihāras. The one the canon lists last, not because it is least important, but because in Thanissaro's reading, and I want to flag this as his synthesis, consonant with the canon but not stated explicitly in the suttas. Equanimity does something the other 3 cannot do for themselves. It acts as both their support and their corrective. It is the floor that lets the warmth stand. Here is the pairing, as cleanly as I know how to say it. When you encounter suffering that can be stopped, karuṇā moves toward it and works to stop it. When you encounter suffering that cannot be stopped, not by you, not now, not maybe ever, karuṇā alone is a posture the heart cannot sustain. The wish to relieve the suffering, meeting the fact that the suffering will not be relieved, generates exactly the collapse we have been calling the near enemy. The energy of karuṇā has nowhere to go. It folds back on itself. The practitioner becomes a second site of suffering, one of 2 now where there was one before. This is where upekkha does its work. Equanimity is not the absence of caring. Thanissaro is careful about this. It is the quality of mind that lets you remain in the presence of what cannot be fixed without creating additional suffering, yours on top of theirs, and without abandoning the field, the hospice worker who comes back tomorrow. The therapist who stays in the room for the 15th year. The friend who shows up for the dying without needing them to be other than they are. That quality of staying with, that is upekkha doing its work underneath the karuṇā. The canon puts these two together in Thanasaro's reading, because separately they fail. Karuṇā without upekkha tips into the near enemy, drowning in what it wanted to lift. Upekkha without karuṇā tips into something else, the equanimity of the water buffalo we met in episode 30. The quality of not caring dressed up as acceptance. The disengagement that mistakes itself for wisdom because it has gone quiet inside. Both failures share the same surface feature. Neither of them is actually moving toward the suffering of others in a way that helps. The first is moving toward and drowning. The second is failing to move at all. Together, the two qualities are mutually corrective. The warmth has somewhere to rest. The stability has something worth being stable for. I want to say one more thing about this pairing before we move on, because it is easy to hear it as abstract and miss what it is actually pointing at. The Brahmavihārā practice is not a doctrine. It is a description of qualities of mind you can develop. The pairing is something that can be felt in a specific moment by a specific person, sitting with a specific instance of someone else's suffering. You will know it when the warmth in your chest stays warm without buckling. You will know its absence when the warmth tips, when something in you collapses, and what was care a moment ago is now panic, paralysis, or the urge to leave the room. The canon is naming what you may already have felt the difference of, without having the vocabulary for it. Now to the second thing the canon teaches about developed karuṇā. The qualifier I asked you to hold on to in chapter 1, apamana, immeasurable. In the canonical formula, karuṇā is not described as compassion for one person. It is not described as compassion for the people in your life, or the suffering you happen to encounter, or the category of beings you find easiest to care about. The qualifier, the same one applied to metta, mudita, and upekkha, is apamana, without measure, without boundary, the same warmth pervading the first direction, the second, the third, the fourth, above, below, all around, the whole encompassing cosmos. This is the development arc of the practice. You do not start there. You start with the most accessible case. The Visuddhimagga's instructions begin with someone already beloved, a teacher, a mentor, someone whose well-being is easy to wish for. From that foundation, the practitioner extends outward to neutral people, outward to difficult people, outward to all beings without distinction. The same quality scaled past the natural limits of preference and resemblance. This is also what Mathieu Ricard was generating in Davidson's laboratory in 2004. The state the researchers called non-referential compassion, compassion without a specific object. The Pali parallel is apamana karuṇā, immeasurable compassion. We met it from one side in episode 6 when we talked about what the gamma synchrony meant. We are meeting it from the other side now by understanding what kind of training produces it. It is not a special spiritual gift. It is a trainable quality of mind that has been extended past the points where untrained compassion usually stops. I want to say something honest about this. Most of us, most of the time, are nowhere near apamana karuṇā. We have compassion for the people we love. We have a softer kind of caring for people we vaguely know. We have something thinner than that, pity, maybe, or distant concern, for strangers in difficulty, and for people we find unpleasant, for people who have hurt us, for people whose suffering we feel they brought on themselves. We have something even thinner than that. Sometimes nothing at all. sometimes the opposite. The canon is not telling you that you should already feel boundless compassion. It is telling you that boundless compassion is possible, that what looks like a natural limit on caring's, in many cases, an untrained limit, that the same quality that warms toward the beloved can, with practice, over time, extend further than the untrained heart imagines. The development arc is real. The destination, in the canonical claim, is real. Ricard's brain scan does not prove the canonical claim, but it does demonstrate that the trained version of this quality is not nothing. Something has been built. Something registers from the outside. So how does the practice actually work? I want to keep this brief because the technical instruction belongs to other episodes and other teachers, but the principle matters here. You begin where the quality can take root, with yourself, or with someone already loved. The instruction is not to summon a heroic compassion for the hardest case. The instruction is to develop the quality in conditions where it can actually grow, and then to extend it. The Brahmavihārā practice is a gardener's discipline. You do not plant the tree in the rock. You plant it in the soil where it will grow, and you let the roots reach. This means, among other things, that compassion for yourself is not a sentimental afterthought. It is the foundation. The mind that cannot wish itself well will struggle to wish others well in any sustained way. The practitioner who treats themselves with the harshness they have inherited from somewhere, and many practitioners in this audience know exactly the harshness I am referring to, will find that the warmth they try to extend outward keeps running into a wall on the way back in. Karuṇā for the self is not narcissism. It is the practice making sure the soil under the tree is alive. Thanissaro puts this directly in an essay called Educating Compassion, which I want to set up now because it is the bridge into the next episode. The Buddha, he writes, often referred to himself as a doctor. From his point of view, we are all sick and dying on a subtle level. All of us, every one. And so we all deserve continual compassion, including the practitioner, including you. The instruction to be compassionate in the presence of the sick or dying is not enough on its own. Compassion needs to be educated, trained, developed in the conditions where it can grow, so that it is actually available when the harder conditions come. And the harder conditions are what the next episode is about. We have been building, over the last several episodes, a quality of heart that can stay present with what is real. Through metta, the foundational goodwill, through upekkha, the steady ground, and now through karuṇā, the warmth that moves towards suffering without being swept away by it. The three together are the mind the practice is trying to make available, not invulnerable, not distant, not detached. The ground is solid. The warmth is real. The equanimity protects the compassion from becoming the thing it is responding to. The compassion ensures the equanimity is not merely detachment in disguise. This is what the practice looks like when it meets the territory of actual difficulty. Not the pleasant end of the Brahmavihārā range, the sitting in warm goodwill on a cushion. The other end, the place where what is arising is hard, where someone is in pain that cannot be stopped, where the limit of what helping can do is finally real. In the closing chapter, I want to make this concrete, and I want to set up what the next episode will ask us to face. Chapter 4, Landing. So let me make this concrete. The territory where this matters is not a meditation cushion. It is a bedside. It is the kitchen where someone you love is sitting with a diagnosis that will not be reversed. It is the phone call from the friend whose marriage is ending and who needs you not to fix it. It is the morning, somewhere down the line, when the news arrives that you have been preparing for and have not actually prepared for. It is the room where a parent is dying or a child is in trouble that no amount of your wishing will undo. It is whichever instance of unfixable suffering is, in your own life, the one this episode has been bringing to mind. The quality we have been building is what makes it possible to be in those rooms without leaving them, either by walking out or by collapsing inside. The exhausted hospice worker is not failing at compassion. The therapist who burns out at year 15 is not failing at compassion. The friend who can no longer return the calls is not failing at compassion. They are in its near enemy. The practice the Canon is describing is what protects against that specific collapse, not by making the heart cold, but by giving the warmth a floor to stand on. Not by lowering the caring, but by deepening the ground. And the other failure, the pity, the polite distance, the registered and moved on response, that is not protection either. It is the heart never having entered in the first place. Karuṇā lives in neither place. It lives in the middle, the warmth that moves toward, the stability that does not drown. For those of us who have sat with loss, who have watched someone we love go through something that could not be lifted, this distinction is not academic. You have probably done both kinds of failure already. Most of us have. The hours when we were too far away to help, and the hours when we were too close to function. The Canon is naming what you have lived, and the practice it points toward is what would have let you stay. There is a short essay by Thanissaro called Educating Compassion in his collection, Purity of Heart. It is a meditation on what it would mean to bring this quality into the room where human life meets its limit. Toward the end of the essay, he gives an instruction. It is 12 words long, and it carries, I think, more weight each time I read it. He writes, "Meditate as an act of compassion, both for yourself and for others." That is all. Meditate, sit, develop attention, steady the mind, cultivate the Brahmavihāras. Not as a private project for your own well-being, not as a hobby or a wellness practice, as an act of compassion. For yourself, because the mind that has not been trained cannot help effectively when help is needed. For others, because the mind you will bring into the next difficult room, trained or untrained, is the single most consequential variable in what becomes possible there. Thanissaro adds a phrase at the end of that sentence, a qualifier. He writes the instruction as something to follow even when death feels distant. Even when the room with the bedside is, for the moment, hypothetical. Even when no one you love is currently in trouble. Especially then. Because the time to develop the quality is before the conditions arrive that require it. The garden is planted in the off-season. The roots reach down before the storm. The qualifier matters because the next episode will not have it. We have spent 4 episodes building this quality of heart, metta, upekkha, and tonight, karuṇā, the warmth that moves towards suffering without being swept away by it. 3 Brahmavihāras, the same training in 3 orientations, the mind the practice is trying to make available. The next episode asks what happens when the qualifier falls away, what happens when death is not far away, what remains when this moment ends. Episode 8, What Remains. We will see you there.